Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's roundtable session with North Carolina Fire Chief Consulting in collaboration with the North Carolina Association of Fire Chiefs. We appreciate you being here this morning and thank you for joining us for this educational program. I'll be joining you today with several members of our core team of consultants from across North Carolina Fire Chief Consulting. And we have several of those folks with us here this morning. Chief David Bullens from Statesville is with us, as well as Chief Frank Blackley from Wilmington, Chief Chris Perry from Zebulon, Chief Wayne Hamilton from Asheville, and Chief Mike Varnell from Rocky Mount. Robert McNally from Charlotte will be adding quite a bit to the presentation this morning. I'd like an opportunity to introduce Robert McNally to you here this morning before we pull the PowerPoint presentation over. Robert does much of the GIS work with North Carolina Fire Chief Consulting. Robert has a background in EMS and served as a paramedic. Robert, if you'll come on and just introduce yourself to the group for a moment, that would be great.
Thanks, Chief. And the rest of the chiefs out there, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you about this important topic.
Thank you. Thank you. So Robert works with us on all the fire station location information. You'll be hearing a lot from him today, and our team of fire chiefs will be adding in information as well. So thank you for being here this morning and being able to share this information. We're going to go ahead and pull over our screen here today and share this with everyone, and hopefully you'll be able to see this. And we'll go ahead and get this started from the beginning. So we thank you for being here and being a part of this discussion here today. We are providing our third in this series of presentations with Roundtable. We've done a couple of these already, and I know I see some of the names have been with us before, so we appreciate that. We know this is in the holiday season, and we have been, we hope you have had an enjoyable Christmas, and we wish all of you a happy 2021. We hope that 2021 is better than 2020 has been for many folks. But we have been trying to pull this together during the pandemic season to help continue educational opportunities for fire chiefs across the state. That's become more difficult during the pandemic. And the State Chiefs Association, as you know, has had to defer the midwinter conference and other educational opportunities. And so part of this effort is to help to provide some of that gap that is occurring and continue that important educational efforts during that period of time. So we thank the North Carolina Association of Fire Chiefs. We thank Executive Director Jay Quisnett and the board for allowing us to provide this information and continue this outreach. Again, the purpose of this program is to provide just some information. We're going to try to keep this brief this morning as we have the other programs, just opportunity to learn. The topics that we're presenting have been what were identified in a survey that we did initially for these first three sessions. And we're going to do another survey post today here at the beginning of 2021. We're going to ask some similar questions. What are items of interest to you? And what we will do is provide back those things that the group says that are of interest to you. So these first three sessions are those things that the group said was of interest. We had about 255 responses, which was great. And we have tried to provide those types of things. We've provided these at the times that folks have said they were interested. And if you look at the charts, these are the things that folks said they were most interested in. We talked about strategic planning in October. We talked about professional development last month in November. And this month, we're talking about station location planning. Those were just some of the topics that were most popular within the survey. And so that brings us to why we are talking about fire station planning today. North Carolina Fire Chief Consulting is a full service consulting provider. We focus on North Carolina. We're all about North Carolina. That is our home. That is our purpose. And we are North Carolina League of Municipalities fire consulting provider, which enables us to work with all municipalities in North Carolina directly. And that is our focus area, and anything that a municipality or a fire department needs, we either provide directly or can assist in making sure that services are needed. And these are a few of the folks that we have worked with here recently in North Carolina. You probably will recognize a jurisdiction near you. So these are some of the cities and counties that we have served this past year, and been able to touch base one way or another. Many of these have been with have been with station location projects, executive search and selection. We have been able to do some innovative projects this year, so we appreciate that opportunity and being able to serve our home state. The work that we do in all components is really around continuous improvement. What are we doing today? How can we better improve? What are the measures we can put in place? We reevaluate and we improve and adjust accordingly. And station location is no different to that. As we think about station location, it really is one of the most important decisions, long-term decisions, especially that a fire chief helps to make. I live in Burlington, so I'm using a Burlington station as an example in the pictures here. And this is one of Burlington's most newest station. And when you think about that long-term station placement, it's certainly very important. I've had the chance over my career to do about 6 or 7 new fire stations as a fire chief. And so that station location becomes so very important. And this was Burlington's most recent station that Chief Jay Smith worked on. And you think about the location being very important and how long-term a fire station is. You know, I had a case when was serving in Asheville, we looked at potentially relocating a station or closing a station. And that becomes really difficult because the fire station is such a part of the infrastructure of a community. So when you choose a location, that location becomes so important. And we try to assist municipalities and jurisdictions with trying to make sure that that location is well chosen and is data driven and data based, because it's being such a long-term decision for a fire chief, a city manager, county manager, whoever it may be, in making that decision. So we try to provide the data and information that helps make that decision a responsible one. It's a home. It's the home for firefighters a third of their life. You see the kitchen. I put the kitchen picture in for a reason, because not only is it a infrastructure for the community, but it's a home for the firefighters. And that location becomes so critical that it's in a great location. When we look at the location for stations, and Robert McNally is going to speak to some of these components here in just a moment, but that mapping is essential using the geographical information systems. And Robert is an expert at this, and he is so very talented in being able to look at all the aspects of the GIS system and geographical information system. There's just a couple we have worked with recently. Graham is on the right-hand side. We recently assisted Graham with some station location. We're currently working with Morehead City on the coast and working with some of their locations, and use those as examples. But looking and using the GIS system and the GIS layers is so very important in determining a station location, because there's so much data that's available to you to be able to make responsible decisions and choose such an excellent location for a station. I'm gonna pull this slide up, and I used the example for Morehead City on this when we look at the current conditions. And so this was a current condition and station location map data for Morehead City, looking at the base map, looking at the city limits, the district area, looking at the drive time analysis, travel time, what is the mutual aid, what's the automatic aid for Morehead City. We looked at the OSFM mileage extent for engines and ladders, population density, demand density, the risk by land, and also zoning. And also flood maps was an important piece there. So this was just an example of the scope that we looked at with Morehead City. So when we think about the GIS piece and being able to apply GIS layers in making decisions about recommending locations, Robert, you want to elaborate some on that, and you maybe use this example to help chiefs on the call understand some of the importance of the GIS mapping?
Well, there's like you said, Chief, there's so much data out there that you can implement into the GIS. It's almost overwhelming. The key is being able to use it in such a way that it it provides you with the accurate answer for what you're asking. In this case, it's where should I place a fire station, or where should I evaluate my fire station locations and see if they're still in the right place. All the communities change, and this is just one piece, the current conditions, just looking at a benchmark of where people are now. But all communities change, they have a plan for change, and driving that forward is one of the aspects that GIS can help you with.
So one of the first pieces we look at in determining that is, where are you today? Where is your current conditions? What does that look like for your situation today? Your stations may be in a good location. Your current stations may be in good locations. They may not. Your growth in your community may have changed. It may be going in a different direction for one reason or another. So we have to first look at those current locations. And then as your community has changed, we may look at where demands have changed. And so in this example, we look at those where the demands are. And there is a module or a component that is looked at on the vulnerability risk index. And we have these same two models that we shown just a moment ago, both for Morehead City and Graham, where we look at demand and we look at where the calls are occurring. Robert, would you like to elaborate on this component just a little bit?
Sure. Well, one of the things you can do is, obviously you can plot points on a map. The problem with that is when you have an area that you frequently go to, it's going to have a point on top of a point on top of a point. So we do a density analysis here to kind of show the highlights of where the demand is most intense. And that's just one visual, and that's fine and great. But the most important thing is when you look at the drive time, or the ISO extent, or the state fire marshal extent of distance, is how much demand can you cover from your fire stations. And so if you're not covering enough, that may mean that you need to have additional fire stations. Or if you are, it's also a way to determine whether or not you have adequate coverage when you go to do your standard of cover document.
Okay. So just examples of demand and being able to look at where your calls are occurring. We do look at the ISO coverage analysis, and what is the ISO saying? As Robert mentioned earlier, what's that engine company coverage at the 1.5 mile distance, and what's the ladder company coverage at the 2.5 mile distance? And so you can see from this model, we did some modeling against that, and we're going to talk about ISO again here in just a moment and some of the pieces of it. But the ISO model certainly was something we look at, but also is there a locally adopted standard of cover or service level that is desired? And are you following a 4-minute travel time, or is there a different standard that you're looking at for your community as well? We also try to incorporate community risk reduction in everything that we look at. We think that is certainly important. Frank Blackley does a wonderful job in looking at that, along with Wayne Hamilton. They're two of our folks that do a really good job in looking at these components. And I think they're both on the call with us, and they may like to speak up on this. I'll just give a couple visuals on this, but looking at, as an example, some of the flood potentials in Graham's picture over here on the left. But then also we looked at things such as the demographic information. So Chief Blackley, is there something maybe you would like to add on the community risk reduction piece that falls into the station location?
I think a lot of what Robert has already talked about, a lot of that will correlate directly with where your responses are based on your demographics, whether there's low income, your education levels. A lot of that corresponds directly with where our responses tend to be, and trying to figure out exactly where's the best station location to place the station. Looking at that also encompasses what he's already talked about with land use, things of that nature, because land use can change along with your demographics, and knowing how that is changing can directly affect where you may want to locate a fire station.
Good. Good. So that's something we try to look at is, the data, but also expanding that data out to looking at community risk reduction. We think that that's an important piece that any fire department should be looking at holistically in all of their aspects of providing services to their community and looking at the community risk reduction component as well. So that optimal fire station location is so critical. And in doing so, we typically look at determining that vulnerability risk index. And so I think the message that we want to convey here is when you think about looking at that location is look at a number of components, not making the decision based on one piece. We showed some of the where's the calls occurring. We think about the ISO piece and the 1.5 and the 2.5 mile coverage areas that are necessary. We think about the piece for community risk reduction and some of those components, but thinking about as many components as possible, trying to use many inputs in making that decision. And so we give a couple examples here: the population levels, the land use zoning, the demand history, the benchmarking coverage, all the travel time objectives. So the message is that when you think about a station location, being very diverse with the number of inputs and trying to look at the need as comprehensively as possible. Robert, would you like to add some additional comments about that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to develop a matrix that incorporates all these different inputs that you want to put in. And it could be lots of different things. It could be addresses, it could be building locations, it could be the size of buildings. All these sorts of things can be put in. Just be careful that you are putting in something that's going to effectively make a difference in the fire station location versus just a data point. But certainly, as many data points that affect the location should be used in put into a matrix. Because if you look at all these things separately, you're going to get three different, like in this example, you look at these three things separately, you're going to get three different answers of where to put the fire station. So you need to incorporate them all into a risk index so that you can plot the location of a future fire station.
And that's really what this GIS model and the brains behind that do, and the computer picks that location when you put all the variables into that, correct? You may want to take a moment to explain that.
Yeah, basically you take each one of your variables and you weight the risk of each one of them, and then you basically bring them all together. You meld them all together into creating a overall weighted risk index, and that then is applied to your coverage area. So the computer, you say, okay, I have two stations, I want to find a third. What will happen then is the computer will generate a location based upon optimizing that total score. So let's say your total score is 1,500, and right now you have 1,200. It's going to try to get as close to 1,500 as possible, citing that third station, wherever it may be. Now, when that happens, that's a good thing and a bad thing in that you have to make sure that that point is a viable candidate. If that point is already used up somewhere else, then you have to sort of limit your candidate choices. But nonetheless, the computer will try to optimize the score, picking that extra station.
Okay, good. And so the intelligence behind the GIS system really takes all of those inputs and allows you to see the optimal location. And realistically, we know when we're looking for that optimal location may not be available. The land may not be available, but it gives you, this is the optimal location, and it gives you a starting point. Okay, this is optimal, so what's available close to that? It gives you a starting point to be able to start looking from it. One of the models that we typically use is a hex grid system. And this is a city that we recently assisted in Bridgeport. And this is just an example. We typically use a hex grid system, and it's that hexagon in looking at each of these areas and determining the needs in each of these areas. We like the hex grid system because all the areas are covered equally, and we typically use that, and the response time's equal. Robert, you want to maybe elaborate on the hex grid system that we use?
Yeah, there's a number of ways to go about this. Now, if you think about this grid as circles, you're going to have spaces between the circles, right? But if you think about it as squares or diamonds, when you think about a square, the distance to the side of the square is less than the distance to the corners of the square. So the hex grid kind of eliminates all those problems in trying to determine a location. We use a smaller hex grid than probably like some other people might use, but that's because we kind of want to be a little more precise in our location selection. And that's why the hex grids, you have a smaller location, but it's really no mind because the computer can handle it. So it's just the computer trying to select the hex grid location that maximizes the score.
There are other credible models as well. This is a model that Robert and I and some other folks worked on in using a diamond planning model, and that's a best practices model as well. And it's a very credible model. This is a county system, and using that diamond model is another way of looking at each of those areas and what are the needs in those areas and where are stations needed and where is a priority of station needs. So the diamond model is another of those best practices models. So we look at some things such as the distance to the fire stations, what's developable land, the call volume, where is response time to calls over 4 minutes. Again, the population, developed land, what's the structure, square footage, risk score, what's property valuation look like, and then looking at the areas outside of 5 road miles. All of those are data points that can be fed into those calculations. ISO previously, we ran into this recently and had a fire chief ask, we used to count hydrants. And so ISO though doesn't use that component within the current schedule. It was used in the previous schedule. So I just made a note to that to say that the ISO is not using that today. But that was used previously. It can be an indicator today, but it's not used by ISO. But all of those other components, are good models, and you can use hydrants if you choose to. But just a number of variables that you can look at in trying to determine where is the need and where is that need today and where is it going to be in the long term. And the GIS system is really the key to that. So data is just absolutely essential in that station planning piece as well. And I think the better you know your data and that response data, especially when you can look at data over a period of time. We really try to look at incident data at least for a 3-year period of time, more if we can, but 3 years is great when we can get a 3-year period of time. 5 is even better. And so when we can look at that data, it feeds into the GIS system, and we really try to look at the call data and what the trends might be within that period of time. So one of the pieces is we also look at is what will the impact of that station be on the standard of cover. So one of the questions as a fire chief may be okay, you're going to add this station. So you're going to spend a significant amount of money in building that station, and some recent estimates that we've done for some municipalities putting a new station somewhere around $7 to $8 million. So we're going to spend a lot of capital money up front. The cost of adding personnel on the municipal stations roughly $1 million per year. So we're going to be increasing operating money significantly. We're going to spend a significant amount of capital money. What do we get for that? What changes for that? So we want to look at what's your current standard of cover, and then what is the projection for the change with the standard of cover with this station added. So a kind of a before and after. So we have to look at what is the current standard of cover, and then what is the projected change with this station. And we give an example here of some data analysis we try to do. We have done quite a bit with the firehouse system as well as emergency reporting in looking at those standards. So what's the call processing time, what's response time, what's the travel time, which makes the total response time. But when we now add this station or relocate this station, how does that change that model? What will that model look like differently with this station? As fire chief, I always had to answer that question. How's this going to change the outcome? City managers want to know, how's this going to change the outcome? What will our outcomes be different with this additional station? And not only the capital expense, but sometimes more difficultly, what will the operating expenses be significantly different? And what's the outcomes going to be? So we try to look at that model as well. The other question that is prevalent is, okay, what's the impact going to be on the ISO side of this equation, particularly around deployment? And so I just put an example of a city's most recent ISO evaluation. You'll see one of the components here is deployment. So with this station, will that station improve the overall ISO rating enough to be able to say that it will? One of the cities we're working with now, we're saying, will the new station make an impact, positive impact on the rating or not? We want to make sure that that fire chief has the opportunity to say that it will or it will not. So it's something you're trying to look at as well. Will that deployment of that station or changing that station make a difference or not? We want to make sure that that chief doesn't have the the premise that it will if it won't type thing. So what is that ISO impact as well? Okay. With that, let's take some questions that you might have. We have our group here together today of our staff with us on the call, as well as Robert McNally is here as our GIS specialist. So we'll come back here as a group. We'll be glad to take questions through the chat. Also, folks can open up the voice and just ask a question. We'll be glad to answer any questions that folks might have. Let's go ahead and take any questions you might have today about fire station location planning, any things that you might like to know that we haven't spoken about here this morning, or anything that you'd like further detail on the things we covered in the slides. Robert, there's some things that you would like to add that we didn't speak about here today while folks are thinking about their questions today?
Well, getting data it used to be more complicated than it is today. We have a lot more GIS data that's out there. You have your RMS system, of course, you can extract data from, but as far as GIS data, we have federal sources that you can tap. Homeland Security Open Data, Highfeld Open has tons of data in there as well. Your state may have some data that you can North Carolina has some data out there, especially flood data that you can bring into the GIS. And then of course, your city or county would also have GIS data and other data that you would need to do some of this analysis, especially the zoning land use, future land use, comprehensive plan information that's out there. So those are all data points that you should collect and glean through before you initiate a project.
It does vary quite a bit. There are some of the jurisdictions we've worked with that have a much more robust GIS system. Some counties, for example, have a more robust system, or municipalities have a more robust system than others. Some GIS systems that Robert plugs into have more data than others. So he can glean more data from some than others. And as we look at it, he's able to kind of plug in and see what's available when we're talking about a project or a need. He's able to look at that and see that up front. And you're able to kind of see what's available so that a chief is able to determine what might be available to him. Is that correct?
That's correct. Another data source I failed to mention, but is very important, of course, is the U.S. Census Bureau. They have tons of data. They're authoritative. As we know, there's some issues with the latest census that might come out that may alter the figures, but they are the figures that are tabulated by the U.S. government, and there's just a ton of information there. The new census is coming out. The estimated 2019 population is out, but the nitty-gritty population or census data is not coming out until later this year. So you have to wait for that and see what occurs with the tabulation. Let's put it that way.
Any other members of our fire chiefs consulting group that would like to comment here this morning? about anything that we've covered?
Chief, this is
Darnell?
David. I'll put just a couple comments to reiterate what Robert's been saying, but running the model, I think that's just the key, is just don't do this one time, run it annually or some periodic time frame. But I think any of the ones, the grids, whatever one you choose, is to stick with it. But then you're able to not only, run that compared to your existing fire stations, and then you're not only able to tell your elected officials or your city management, where you need a fire station, but you could also predict when you're going to need that fire station with the scoring that using the GIS data capabilities, you can see any trend lines that are coming. So you know when these stations are going to be needed, and you can prepare your people who hold those purse strings for down the road.
You're right, Chief. You're right, Chief. And then, one of the things that can help you out as it's do a monthly, reporting of your performance. And when you start to see, and then trend that quarterly and annually, maybe for your annual report, but then you can start to see trends going on. And if you start to see some trends that are concerning, or some areas, especially when you plug it back into GIS, some areas that are being underserved, then you can start to formulate this plan of, okay, what do we need to do? And that comes along with like your standard of cover. It shouldn't be a static document. It should be almost reviewed and revised every single year.
Chief, I'll add a few things. Yeah, I'll add a few things, kind of tagging on to what Chief Bullens and Robert has said about SOC and total response time. We know we talk about total response time all the time, and we as fire chiefs are always looking for opportunities for improvement. Well, when we have that discussion about total response time, we always know that alarm handling thing is with that dispatch center. So we're dealing with an agency right now, which has got some extended alarm handling times, but a lot of times that's out of our purview, that's out of our control. We can have relationships, we can help with that, but that's a hard one to fix. Now we can affect the turnout time to some point, but that's also a hard thing to do. I mean, you can only shave so much time off with the way your stations are laid out and how far your trucks are from the living quarters. But travel time, that's what this whole thing today we're talking about with station or location, it really tags into that travel time. And as we all know, the travel time is the biggest piece of that pie. Those three things go into that total response time, which improve or decrease that performance. So that travel time is a huge thing in this station location, and all the work that Robert does with GIS to make that thing fine tune it and get a better location to improve the performance. It's a big deal. So we often talk about the alarm handling and the turnout time, but we always say we really can't affect travel time because the station is where the station is. But that's what this is really all about: improving that travel time, improving that location, and improving that overall performance for your department. And I think another thing is we're talking about SOC is understanding the baseline and the benchmark, what they are, having a baseline, like Robert said, run those numbers periodically. Those numbers always change. So just kind of keep an eye on it. Things change in your community, and just keep an eye on those baseline and benchmark numbers. And that's a moving target. We always want to move that to make our performance better. So that's just a few thoughts I had to add on to what everyone else has said.
That's good. Todd Tuttle does a lot of our statistical analysis work, does a great job with that and determining that SOC. And as Chief Arnell said, that's important to do on a regular basis. So we see the value in that frequently. We do have a question, Robert, for you here this morning that one of our participants has. How does the effective response force play into future station planning? For example, we have a high risk area that has a 4-minute travel time for the first arriving unit, but we cannot achieve a set benchmark for the balance of the first alarm since a second due station is out of place. Again, how does the effective response force play into future station planning? For example, we have a high risk area that has a 4-minute travel time for the first arriving unit, but we cannot achieve a set benchmark for the balance of the first alarm since a second due station is out of place.
Well, there's your issue right there that indicates you might need another station. If you're talking about number of apparatus versus number of staff, obviously you can bump up staff and get that achieved perhaps, but like Chief Farnell said, it's the travel time too that could be the problem. So one of the things we do in the current conditions is look at the effective fire force see how that assembly with apparatus and staffing goes, model that and see where the holes are. And then once we locate a fire station, we reevaluate to see how that new fire station is going to impact that effective fire force, and hopefully that there's an improvement that's going to be made at that point, because we do take into account those riskier areas. In that case, the land use, let's say you have an industrial park, obviously no residents, probably not maybe a lot of demand, but it's very risky to the community. So that gets a higher score in that part of the VRI, that vulnerability risk index. So that it gets that weight that it deserves without the demand and without the population, and therefore place that part in the station location placement, and therefore can affect the effective fire force. And of course, once you have the station, you got to staff it. There's more people right there, so that's going to affect it. And one of the other things you should consider, though, is if you have a station that you're thinking about renovation, you should probably think about location first before you lay the money into renovation, just to make sure it's in the right place. And one of the things that this system can do is validate that location, so that you can be confident to know that I can put money back into the station and not waste it in the future if we figure out that this isn't in the right place, we're going to have to do something. So it's a great tool for that.
We recently helped a city do that. They were planning to spend a pretty significant amount of money renovating their downtown station. And the city council said, okay, before we do that, we want to make sure this station's in the right location. We don't mind doing it, but we want to make sure, is it in the best location? And we did the analysis for them and came back and said, it's not in a bad location. You know, it's in a very acceptable location. So they wanted that validity before they spent the money in that endeavor. The other thing I would mention to the question that was posed to us is the importance of looking at reliability, meaning that how often do you have a second call occurring when you do not have enough units to send? In other words, do you have a second simultaneous call happening that's also impacting your effective response force? We also try to look at that type of data. Do you have multiple calls occurring? Because that may be a case where you need another station, but it also may be a case where you need another company as well. So those are questions that we sometimes are posed. Okay. Are there other questions that folks have this morning you'd like to ask? I thank you for the question that was submitted. Are there others that anyone would like to ask this morning? We do thank you for taking time today to be with us. We know this is sandwiched in between Christmas and New Year's, but we hope that this bit of information is helpful and is educational to give you just a little bit more perspective about fire station planning. This information is posted onto the North Carolina Association of Fire Chiefs website and is made available. We will be sending out an additional survey for interest in what additional topics you would like here in 2021, and we encourage you to participate in that. Robert, we thank you for being with us today. All of our NC Fire Chief staff, we thank you for joining us. To everyone who has taken time to be with us today, we appreciate your time and attention. We sincerely wish you a successful, healthy, and happy 2021 ahead. Thank you, take care, and stay safe.